Hi folks, welcome to the lecture on the integumentary system. Strictly speaking, the integumentary system refers to skin, which is a cutaneous membrane, and I want to take this opportunity to review the other kinds of membranes that we've talked about so far in the course. So in general, membranes are coverings or linings. They are often, the inner layer of these tissues includes epithelial cells. They can be modified, like a lot of epithelium, to secrete fluids. They're used to create compartments inside the body, and those are often examples there that we've already talked about are serous membranes. Some protect the body from the outside world, and those would be mucous membranes and cutaneous membrane, like skin. And in general, they're made of loose fibrous connective tissue, sometimes dense fibrous connective tissue with epithelial tissue on the top. So thus far we've talked about three different serous membranes. Remember, these are the membranes that are essentially like a double bag or a water-filled, fluid-filled balloon that encase some of our internal organs. So serous membranes create baggies within the body. They also produce serous fluid that cushions our organs and helps prevent frictional damage. So the three that we've talked about thus far are the peritoneum, which lines the abdominopelvic cavity, the pericardium around the heart, and last but not least, the pleural membranes, the pleura around the lungs. We've also talked about mucous membranes, both the digestive tract and the respiratory tract, as well as the lower parts of the urinary tract and our reproductive tracts are lined with mucous membranes. I'm fond of saying that mucus is our friend. It is part of the way our bodies defend against pathogens that might be invading from the outside. And you find mucous membranes wherever the spaces within that we think of as within our body come into contact with the outside world. We also briefly talked about synovial membranes when we talked about the skeletal system. Freely moving joints are called synovial joints, and these joints are lined with synovial membranes that create synovial fluid that allow lubrication of our joints. So it reduces wear and tear on our hyaline cartilage, which you remember is at the epiphyses of our long bones. It's much thicker than serous fluid, which means it's great for shock absorbing. So on to the main part of this lecture. The word skin is cutis in Latin. So skin is a cutaneous membrane. And the system that involves skin and its accessory organs is the integumentary system. Integument is also another name for skin. So there are 7 functions of the skin. It's a very diverse organ, and it's actually the largest organ in our body. So the first function is that it regulates, our skin helps to regulate body temperature. And it does that in 2 different ways, by vasoconstriction and vasodilation of blood vessels in the dermal or the middle layer of skin, and also by something called piloerection, which involves the hair on our skin standing up and thus trapping a layer of warm air. The next function for skin is protecting the body from trauma. Hence the little hammer over here and the beaker with some sort of corrosive liquid over there. Not very nice. Skin, the upper layer of our skin, the epidermis, is composed of, the upper layer of it is composed of dead cells. And so it's a really great waterproof barrier. Skin is also, perhaps one of its most important functions is that it's the first line of immune defense. So it protects us against pathogens. And it does that in a number of different ways that we'll talk a lot more about next week when we talk about the immune system. Because the upper layer of the epidermis is composed of dead cells, and these are epithelial cells, which, remember, one way to recognize epithelial cells is that they form a continuous, unbroken line of cells. Another function of the skin is a certain amount of excretion of metabolic waste. And then finally, last but not least, our skin comes equipped with sensory receptors that allow us to detect temperature, pressure, pain, fine touch, a number of other sensations that allow our nervous system to tell the rest of the body what's happening outside of ourselves. So skin is composed of 2 layers. So the upper layer is the epidermis. Sorry about my pen here. For some reason, I don't seem to be able to make the size of the pencil smaller. So remember, epi means on top of or above, and derm means skin. Lower layer of skin, the thicker layer, is called the dermis, which kind of makes sense. And then underneath the dermis is the subcutaneous layer. So remember, cutis means skin, so subcutaneous means under the skin. Another way of describing this layer is to call it the hypodermis. And this layer anchors the skin to the tissues underneath it, whatever those might be. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the epidermis. One of the things to be really sure you keep in mind when you're looking at images of the skin, and you definitely for your 4th exam are gonna want to be able to label a block of skin like this. And remember, you want to be able to do that whether it's in color or black and white. One of the things to realize with the epidermis is, and this is easy if you sort of get used to pulling information out of the images, is that the stem cells for the epidermis actually give rise to the hair follicle, the sweat glands, which is this, right? So you can see that the stem cells actually dip down into the dermal layer of skin. As I said before, the cells in the uppermost layer are dead. They become filled as the stem cells, the epidermal stem cells, reproduce. The slightly older cells are pushed closer and closer to the surface of the skin of the epidermis. And as they get closer to the surface, they start to produce exclusively this waterproof protein called keratin. And eventually they die. So these are dead keratinocytes. And they're bound together by adhesive junctions, those cytoplasmic extensions that tie the cells together. And that makes the epidermis a really good waterproof barrier. Now, there are some other functions of the epidermis. The epidermis is the layer of skin that contains cells called melanocytes. So melano for melanin, cyte for cell. And that means that the epidermis is the layer of skin that's responsible for tanning in response to exposure to UV light. Talk more about tanning in a little bit. There are also cells, they're called Langerhans cells. What I want you to remember more than Langerhans cells is that these are resident white blood cells. So they live in the epidermis, and that's part of skin's function of protecting us from pathogens. And then finally, there are other specialized cells that convert cholesterol to vitamin D, and that requires UV light. So we require a certain amount of UV radiation to make vitamin D, but obviously a whole lot of it is going to result in an increased risk for skin cancer. The epidermis is made as a tissue is stratified squamous epithelium. So I'm going to unpack that just a tiny bit. Stratified, the word strata means layered. So when you have more than one layer of cells, we say it's stratified. The shape of this upper layer of cells is squamous. They're nice and flat. And we always label epithelial tissue based on the uppermost layer. Okay, the dermis. The dermis is the thick middle layer of skin. It's made of dense, irregular, fibrous connective tissue. Depending on your age, you have more or less elastin and collagen fibers. The production of those goes down as we age, which is why we wrinkle. As you can see in this image, they're also embedded within this fibrous connective tissue are blood vessels, hair follicles, glands, we'll talk about that, sweat glands and oil glands, as well as sensory receptors. So let's label this image of the dermis and see what all is in here. These two are pointing to a capillary bed, right? And notice that there are no capillaries in the epidermis. So those cells are dependent on diffusion of goodies and removal of waste on the capillary beds in the dermis. We've got a whole variety of different sensory receptors. There are lots of different shapes of these depending on what they do. I'm not going to hold you guys responsible for what the different sensory receptors are, but you should be able to recognize them. In this image, other than the cells in the subcutaneous layer, which are tan, all of the sensory receptors are shown as, and the nervous tissue in this image is shown as yellow. And we've got venules and arterioles, right? You can tell that in a color image because this would be systemic circulation, which means that arterioles will be carrying oxygen-rich blood and venules, relatively speaking, oxygen-poor blood. Let's see, then we've got a sweat gland. So this sort of weird curly thing is a sweat gland, and there's another one here. And another name for sweat glands are sudoriferous. Then we have a hair follicle. Over here in cross-section, we've got hair root, the root of the follicle, another nerve ending, and then right here we have tiny little muscle. So all of our hairs have a tiny little muscle attached to them, which is why when you get scared or you're cold, they can stand up. Those muscles are called erector pili muscles. Then we have an oil gland. Oil glands are also called sebaceous glands. And sebum, which is the fluid that they secrete, contains lipids, but it also contains a number of antimicrobial compounds. Let's see, then over here we have the opening probably to this sweat gland. And then last but not least, the shaft of hair itself. Okay, so the hypodermis is this lower area. Some people describe it as a layer of skin, other people don't. When you get to AP1, if your professor says skin has 2 layers and that's important to them, disagree with them. Let's see. Remember that fat cells are called adipocytes, and the hypodermal layer, the subcutaneous layer, is adipose tissue. And we all need that layer of adipose tissue. So the integumentary system also includes the accessory organs of the skin, our nails, which are protective coating, back of the fingers, top of the toes. They also actually increase the sensitivity of our fingertips and our toe tips. Hair follicles are technically accessory organs. So the hair grows from epidermal cells, but parts of the follicle are derived from the dermis. Sebaceous glands, we talked about. Sebum lubricates hair and skin, helps prevent dehydration, keeps bacteria from growing. Blackheads are blocked sebaceous glands. And then sweat or sudoriferous glands are embedded in the dermis and help to regulate body temperature. There's a picture of a fingernail. Boom. Okay, skin cancer, public health announcement. So there are a couple different types of skin cancer. The really worrisome one is melanoma. And melanoma is often suspected if a particular spot on one's skin meets any of the ABCD criteria. So A is for asymmetry, meaning the mole or the discoloration is not the same size, an irregular border, uneven color, being bigger than the typical pencil eraser, and the last one in particular, something that changes over the course of time. These are all images from the CDC's messaging about skin cancer. And it absolutely is the case that tanning is a response to radiation damage. That's just the facts. Your skin responds to the assault by ultraviolet light by increasing the production of melanin, and that absorbs it, because melanin being dark, will absorb the light, the UV light, before it can get to your DNA. All right, so just to sum up, right, what tissues make up the integumentary system, or maybe a better way of saying it, make up skin as an organ. Call up the image in your head of that block of skin, right? There are 4 basic tissue types, remember. There's epithelial tissue, which lines and covers. There's muscular tissue, nervous tissue, and connective tissue. If you think about that block of skin, well, the epidermis is epithelial tissue, stratified squamous epithelium. You've got the arreter pili muscles associated with the hair follicles. You have nervous tissue in the form of nerve endings, sensory nerve endings. And the dermis is fibrous connective tissue. So even without considering a lot of the accessory structures, we can tell that skin is an organ made of all 4 basic tissue types. So one of the things we want you guys to be able to do is to look at a diagram of skin and tell us, be able to label it.
Tattoos have often been presented in popular media as either marks of the dangerous and deviant or trendy youth fads. But while tattoo styles come and go, and their meaning has differed greatly across cultures, the practice is as old as civilization itself. Decorative skin markings have been discovered in human remains all over the world, with the oldest found on a Peruvian mummy dating back to 6000 BCE. But have you ever wondered how tattooing really works? You may know that we shed our skin, losing about 30 to 40,000 skin cells per hour. That's about 1 million per day. So how come the tattoo doesn't gradually flake off along with them? The simple answer is that tattooing involves getting pigment deeper into the skin than the outermost layer that gets shed. Throughout history, different cultures have used various methods to accomplish this. But the first modern tattooing machine was modeled after Thomas Edison's engraving machine and ran on electricity. Tattooing machines used today insert tiny needles loaded with dye into the skin at a frequency of 50 to 3,000 times per minute. The needles punch through the epidermis, allowing ink to seep deep into the dermis, which is composed of collagen fibers, nerves, glands, blood vessels, and more. Every time a needle penetrates, it causes a wound that alerts the body to begin the inflammatory process, calling immune system cells to the wound site to begin repairing the skin. And it is this very process that makes tattoos permanent. First, specialized cells called macrophages eat the invading material in an attempt to clean up the inflammatory mess. As these cells travel through the lymphatic system, some of them are carried back with a bellyful of dye into the lymph nodes, while others remain in the dermis. With no way to dispose of the pigment, the dyes inside them remain visible through the skin. Some of the ink particles are also suspended in the gel-like matrix of the dermis, while others are engulfed by dermal cells called fibroblasts. Initially, ink is deposited into the epidermis as well, but as the skin heals, the damaged epidermal cells are shed and replaced by new, dye-free cells, with the topmost layer peeling off like a healing sunburn. Blistering or crusting is not typically seen with professional tattoos, and complete epidermal regeneration requires 2 to 4 weeks, during which excess sun exposure and swimming should be avoided to prevent fading. Dermal cells, however, remain in place until they die. When they do, they are taken up, ink and all, by younger cells nearby, so the ink stays where it is. But with time, tattoos do fade naturally, as the body reacts to the alien pigment particles, slowly breaking them down to be carried off by the immune system's macrophages. Ultraviolet radiation can also contribute to this pigment breakdown, though it can be mitigated by the use of sunblock. But since the dermal cells are relatively stable, much of the ink will remain deep in the skin for a person's whole life. But if tattoos are embedded in your skin for life, is there any way to erase them? Technically, yes. Today, a laser is used to penetrate the epidermis and blast apart underlying pigment colors of various wavelengths, black being the easiest to target. The laser beam breaks the ink globules into smaller particles that can then be cleared away by the macrophages. But some color inks are harder to remove than others, and there could be complications. For this reason, removing a tattoo is still more difficult than getting one, but not impossible. So a single tattoo may not truly last forever, but tattoos have been around longer than any existing culture, and their continuing popularity means that the art of tattooing is here to stay.
So skin helps regulate temperature, right? Temperature is important for body homeostasis because if temperature gets too high, your proteins are going to get cooked, i.e. denatured. If it's too low, you're not going to have enough molecular motion for chemistry to take place. So think about the different functions of skin that are at the beginning of the PowerPoint and just flip it around and connect it to body homeostasis and to other body systems, and you will be all set.